Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm a financial mediator and business valuation expert in St. Louis, Missouri. My guest today is Michael Koeppel, and we're doing a series about various case studies. He has over 30 years of experience and primarily focused on technology, manufacturing, and service organizations in one of his two companies, which is he founded eCapital Financing, which helps startups in the LA area and Western New York regions, but he also owns Lakelet Advisory Group located in New York. So in this series, we're going to explore various business valuation case studies, kind of highlighting unique challenges and strategies for each case. And today, we're really going to take a case that is, I think, a little bit difficult for valuation people to understand, or a lot of times they want to get into this space, which is this business valuation case is all around intellectual property. And we're going to walk through the case. We're going to give you some of the things that, Michael had to consider in dealing with this case, and hopefully some best practices for practitioners who want to be in this space, but maybe don't have a good framework to understand all the nuances. So welcome, Michael. How are you?
Oh, thank you, Melissa. It's always a pleasure to deal with you and your team, and I look forward to this podcast and also the series that we'll be producing in the near future.
Well, and I think it's really helpful because, a lot of times in litigation, we're really this sole expert, right? And we either are working with a firm and we maybe have a few other people that are also doing valuations, or we could be a solo practitioner, but sometimes we're working in a box and we really need other valuation credentialed people and expertise to just understand if we're doing it right, if we should consider other things, if we should be more creative. And so I appreciate the fact that you have already developed a lot of these case studies. You have them available for people if they would like to reach out to you, and we may actually put them on some other platforms. But you have full on, written case studies that are invaluable to other practitioners. And we thought that it would be a really good idea to take some of those cases and just have a conversation about them and talk about the nuances of these more intricate valuation issues. So I would say that this is not really a primer. This isn't really to get you to understand what needs to be done in some of these litigation spaces. It's almost to come in the very middle and say, okay, here's something that did happen. Here's the issues that we had to deal with. And it can become maybe a case study that you use as your own, your own experience. Because a lot of times when I was learning, I had to take on other people's knowledge in order to progress myself. Now, I do not necessarily specialize in intellectual property. And so I thought that this is great to highlight you as a practitioner doing these types of cases. And so, even as we get started in this process, Michael, maybe just give them a little idea of some of your background. And, maybe we start talking about how valuing intellectual property is really challenging and why you choose to be in this space.
Oh, thank you. In a previous life, I was very involved in technology. I rose after becoming a certified public accountant. I got into programming, IT. I was a senior IT executive of Fortune 500 companies. I invest and acquired a few medical device companies myself. So I feel comfortable on both sides of the street, if you will, Melissa. And it's just not the number crunching. It's understanding the product and the whole world around intellectual property, which is extremely complicated in the United States. When we do a business valuation or even intellectual property analysis, we bring in a legal specialist who's on our team. That you cannot avoid that side of the issue. Have a lot of experience in it. My niche is in software and medical devices. intellectual property has a whole host of unique challenges to it. Uh, Number one is the marketability that we use as one of the three methodologies in business valuations is so limited by its very definition. If you have a patent on something, it's unique. So you can't say, okay, I'm going to compare it to XYZ. Where if you have a metal fabrication company, for example, there's a lot of multiples out there, and there's a lot of companies out there you can do the research on. The other thing with intellectual property, it's usually in its nascent portion of its career. It's on the life cycle. It's relatively young. Intellectual property obviously cannot last more than 2 decades, but it's usually when we get involved in the IP, it's earlier in the process, before or just as it started to generate money. On this specific case study we're going to talk about, it had a lot of unique twists and turns. This is a fantastic medical device. The owner, she not only had her PhD from MIT and had a great device and a great career path, but she passed at a very young age of, I believe it was about 42 years old. She was the face of the company. She was the founder. She was the chief technology officer. So when you value and take into consideration the company lost her, it had significant impact on the IP. Even though the IP was documented, it couldn't necessarily go to the next level. As we all know, in a lot of the smaller companies, this company had about $25, $30 million in revenue. They didn't have a deep bench. So the loss of the founder impact not only the value of the IP, but of the estate. We were brought in to do a valuation of the entire estate, and this was their main asset within the estate. So it had a couple layers, this business valuation, and that's why I selected to write a case study on this specific one. I don't want to run one that's typical. You know, the more twists and turns in it, the better case study it makes. And I might add, although I'm very verbose in my writing and props, we try to keep our case studies to 1 or 2 pages. Now, if someone needed some more information, if they look on our website or on the platform we'll be talking about to put these case studies, we can provide more information. But this is a synopsis. I don't want to write a book on all the case studies, just to talk about the case study and show some interest in this one.
Well, and what you're talking about is really a valuation of intellectual property in an estate kind of context, right? And
Yes.
so a lot of people from a valuation perspective can value companies for estate purposes, but you also, where else would you do typically, because this is one case study, we're going to talk about a lot of them over the course of time, but where would you also see these valuations of intellectual property typically, fair value or litigation, or where are you really seeing bankruptcy? Like, where are you seeing some of
That's
that
interesting.
happen?
Yeah. I think intellectual property is very prominent in the two ends of the maturity cycle of a company, its infancy and its death, bankruptcies. We have found a very unique niche in doing intellectual property business valuations for universities. Universities have research and development. They go through, they put a lot of money into their IP, but they don't know how to commercialize it. You know, the professors or department may come up with some great intellectual property just because it's something new and improved. Well, how do you commercialize that? What's the value of commercializing that? We're getting more and more pressure from the universities and nonprofit organizations as well, is to, with today's economic terms, is what's this worth? We have, university we're dealing with has over 500 patents. Okay, what are some of these worth? How can we go about doing that without knowing the market as well as the value of that? You got to have a platform and justify going after certain IPs, and also the addition of it, how realistic is to get some royalties from some of these intellectual properties for some of these universities and nonprofit organizations. That's really a niche we've fell into. The other area has been in bankruptcies. I did a lot of work in the bankruptcy realm. And that also adds another layer of complexity with it, like the estate one, which we'll be talking about today. But when you're in bankruptcy, you're not only dealing with the challenges of intellectual property, but you're also dealing with the challenges of a distressed or even a closed business. What is it worth to the creditors, and how can they commercialize that intellectual property?
Well, and that's interesting that you talk about the universities, because one of the things that we're going to talk about is the industry that is involved in this valuation case study. And so I think if you go into a little bit about the industry, it's going to make a lot of sense how the universities are involved in this process, and we can shed a little light into why the universities have such a large list of patents, typically partnering with other people in the medical device community and such. But tell us a little bit more about this valuation case study.
This valuation case study is a medical device for a cardiology unit. It was approved, fortunately, by the FDA process. Having the intellectual property is important, but the good housekeeping seal of approval, the FDA, can take millions of dollars in a long time. Fortunately, before the demise of this individual, they were able to obtain that. The other challenge with regards to intellectual property, which is much more important than probably any other sectors, especially this medical device we're talking about, is the US market is just a sliver of where the opportunities lie for this device. Only about the 32% of all the revenue at the time was coming from the United States. We've found a niche that we're also able to help them out in Brazil. I spent several years of my professional career in Brazil. We are also some Canada, the European community. We're having some problems. They had some problems with regards to China. That's more of a political thing. It doesn't matter who has the best mousetrap. It's just a political challenge right now between the U.S. and China on some of these intellectual property things. But the important thing is, if you have a good medical device that can really be a game changer, you have to think outside of the parochial view that most Americans do. Too often, we all think the world starts in New York and ends in Los Angeles. Well, that's not the truth. It's we're less than 5% of the world population. And health-wise, other countries spend more money on healthcare and health products than the United States. So it's an excellent market outside that. And when one does a valuation, they need to include the entire global approach to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting because, my experience in the medical equipment or even processes is you're typically going to work with a university and get, maybe a doctor lead in a study, and the university will also want to own that patent. And
Yes.
so it's really, if as a company, are you owning the patent? Is the university owning the patent? Are you receiving royalties? Are you paying royalties? And then, realistically, a lot of people that are in the startup community will seek out that relationship with the university in order to get the study done for a cheaper rate, which I don't think that you're still going to be paying a lot of people, including the doctor. And it could be a lot of money to even get that study done. And you have to be really careful about who owns the patent afterwards,
No,
right?
that is so important. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Let's be candid about this. And it's much more emphasis on the universities and key individuals with the universities to get IP. 20, 30 years ago, you had to publish or perish was the terminology for those of us who worked at a university. Now it's how many IP do you have, how many patents, what you're doing with regards to this, and you got to add that. But the challenge has been is that a lot of these universities have not been thinking of the profitability of said patent. Now, on general, we found that on general, it's different universities, but about 10% to 15% is owned by the university for their support. And you got to ask yourself, well, what is that worth? You can't shelf it. It's unfortunately the reality is over 70% of the startups are going to fail, especially in the medical space area. But the university still owns that IP. Just because the company failed does not mean the IP is worthless. It could have been the management. It could have been a whole host of other problems that they had, and it does not deter from the value of the intellectual property itself. So there's a lot of IP sitting out there right now that's valuable, but literally sitting on the shelf as the clock keeps going.
Mm-hmm. Which is important information if you're getting into this space and valuing intellectual property, is understanding some of the nuances and how it's owned and how it's partnered. Again, a 10% piece that's connected to a university is a big deal, at least as you have to address it, right?
Yeah.
But we've thrown out a lot of things, including royalty rates, including cash flow, including not all the words that we need to talk about in this, but like if you're looking at intellectual property, what valuation methods are you typically using, and how are you, like what were some of the things that you had to consider in this situation that either moved you in that valuation method, or what did you need to know within that method that was really some of the tangible pieces of the equation?
Yeah, I know. As business valuators, we have the three legs: income, market, and asset. It's they're still very germane with regard to intellectual property, but a different spin. For example, the income approach, we're taking a look, as you briefly mentioned, Melissa. What's the royalties for that? And I would say, from a personal perspective, I think that's the number one challenge with inventors who want to take their product to the market and do all that. You might be better off just sitting back and just getting the royalties from the product and let some of the big boys do it, mass produce it, and take care of it, and you just collect your quarterly check. Too often they try to build it themselves, not only invent it, and it's a totally different skill set. The other thing is with regards to marketability, you really got to do a market analysis of what this product or device could be used for. And you have to have a realistic assumption of what it could be used for on a global basis. And then the third is with regards to the asset. It's hard to do the asset. One of the key things, and with most IP valuation, you have to look at the replacement cost. Okay, you got the patents. I took 3-4 years to develop. I spend this money. That's part of the asset. And it's the combination and weighting factor of those three that really plays out. But lately, putting more and more emphasis on medical devices. It's different on software, on medical devices, on the royalties. What is the real royalty method that you can get? There's a lot of, as we know, a lot of large international medical companies that are very, very aggressive in acquiring these patents and the royalties, especially for a university or especially for someone who just has the patent. You're better off getting that 10% without owning the whole thing and just let these big boys take it to a global response and get it out there in the market.
But that's still a process of finding, like you're almost finding different investors, different people that help you along the way. And the valuation of it, like from my standpoint, having done valuations for 20 years, the valuation of intellectual property in any capacity is more subjective. It's more, hypothetical. It's more making some assumptions, DCFs and option pricing models and WAC and all of these things.
You hit the nail on the head. It's much more subjective, Melissa, than valuing a normal manufacturing company. I had the fun of dealing with and doing intellectual property valuation for music down in Nashville. Now, I have a 10-year. So what a song's going to be worth or what anything's worth is very, very subjective. I mean, who knows why some artists do so well, others don't. But those are the things that it is extremely subjective. And there are processes and things you have to go through for each industry. But intellectual property, there's a lot of soft assumptions that have to be made to it. And it's not unusual at all, Melissa, on these situations, much more so than other valuations, to have a range.
Mhm.
In your reports, the range is between, in this case study I'm talking about now, the range is between 25 million and 33 million. And it depends on A, B, and C. Uh,
Mhm.
because it's so subjective, though.
Yeah. And are you really, you know, do you feel like IP valuations are more laborious and more in depth than other valuations or require more understanding? Because it's not just as easy as going to like a royalty rate or a royalty database, right? And then picking the right pieces. It's really being able to defend that process and
Yeah,
defend your valuation.
that process is critical to defend it. I would say in the intellectual property, it is a much lengthier report, much more detailed with all the assumptions that you're making. You can't just say, I picked this from the Wall Street Journal on these 6 companies that are in your niche market. That just doesn't work that way with intellectual property. So you really have to document your process and go through it. But it's much more challenging professionally to go through it and do that in that approach than just to have a database with the answers out there with minimal assumptions versus IP, where the assumptions are at least twice as much as that and have such a significant impact.
Well, and what do you think, like if we're talking about this particular case study and we have a medical device company, we have that, they have a date of death or, a certain date that they're valuing this for the estate purposes or probate or whatever it is, or a buy sell, somebody's got to
Mhm.
still own this property. What do you think is really important in an IP valuation to have, like the data, the information, or what significantly can move the needle? Like, is this, are we still in an estate valuation that the discounts are the biggest issue, or what are you seeing is really important in these?
In this specific case study, the estate discounts and everything was important, especially with regards to the individual who filed the patent. The other thing is critically important for us, and we work side by side with an attorney we have on our team who does nothing but sophisticated IP. And he'll read it. I'll put together my notes. He'll go through the patent from a legal perspective, the good, the bad, and the ugly, especially if it's an international patents as well. And that lays as the foundation for doing that. Ironically, though, one of the key things I've noticed over the years is whoever writes the patent has a big impact on the value of the patent. There are some firms that are brilliant at what they do and can take a device and really expand its patent and marketability in an outstanding professional way. And there are others who just don't do that. You want to find someone who specializes not only in IP, which it is, but IP of that device. If it's music, there's the copyrights. If it's medical device, there's firms that just do, there's software. There's a lot of firms that you want to get somebody who has that and who has that experience to go through that process with you.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the reasons why people will shy away from that space because it's a much more complex valuation. It's a much more complex process.
Yeah.
Like, tell us a little bit more about how long it took you to kind of go through this process, or what were some of the sticking points that made it a little bit more difficult?
Yeah, going through the process in this case probably took about time wise about 45 days once we got all the information. The thing that made it most difficult was some of the international patents associated with this one. Although the U.S. patent looked very good, the international patents were an add-on, and that was most of the market. And I would also say in the estate, it added dimension of complexity that the family members, uh, some were very helpful and others weren't, as sometimes we see in these estate matters. And I think if they had to do it all over again, our end client, that they would have selected an attorney who fully understand the nuances of this process.
Now, what happened at the end of this case study that you think is an important learning lesson, or, an important concept to understand if you're going to be doing valuations of intellectual property?
Well, because there's so many assumptions involved, Melissa, and we talked about those a few moments ago, and there are quite a few, is to take a good drafted report and share it with everybody. Validate your assumptions, all sides of the family, the medical devices, the original law firm, for example, who wrote the patents. Other people have a stake in the ground with regards to business valuation. If it's M&A, have them take a look at it and review your assumptions, and because they may be able to fine tune the assumptions or to set you straight. And I'm say, Michael, maybe this assumption isn't applicable for this product because of A, B, and C. The other thing that we brought in on this device is a group of cardiac surgeons who I sat down with and say, okay, here's the device I'm taking a look at. They wanted to replace this medical procedure. Is it going to work? I'm not an MD, but these guys are MDs. They say, well, Michael, here's some of the challenges you have, and here's some of the things you've got to expect. Surprisingly, with medical devices, there's one hurdle that people need to be very cognizant of. Whatever the medical community learned in medical school, that's going to be the solution they're probably using the rest of their career. So if you come in with a better, quicker mousetrap, they may not feel comfortable with it. They may be worried about litigation. It's a very litigious environment. And all these other factors have pronounced impact on the rolling out of any medical device. It could be the best mousetrap. That's why it's paramount that you get the input of some renowned specialist in that area. Say, here's what you use it for, here's the pros, and here's the cons, and this is what you have to do to get over that hurdle.
Now, what was some of the impact of the owner being deceased in this process, and how much time and effort did you have to kind of be concerned about that piece of it as well?
Yeah. Given the role that she played with regards to the patent and everything else, I would say this probably reduced the overall value because of her death by 40 to 50%. She was the rainmaker. She had all the connections. She worked with the medical communities. She had the FDA. She was really the key driver behind it. And, it just stopped. There was no succession plan, nothing along those lines. She just passed, and the next day the family didn't know what to do with it, and the company hadn't rolled this out yet to its full potential. They just made a lot of promises and commitments, and they're still just beyond the prototype stage, so there wasn't much that they could do without her. So we had to take a look at it from that aspect, and it was a significant discount as her loss.
Yeah, like I just think that valuations in this space are so complicated, and it's the same with a startup. It's the same with a pre-market company, that you're making assumptions about the future that really, other than having a crystal ball, you have to support in some capacity. So for valuation people who are kind of, and I also think it's a very lucrative area. There's not a lot of professionals that really specialize in valuations of IP. I know a handful of them around the country, and and you have to be able to support it and defend it in some capacity. So if other valuation people are out there saying, this is a space I want to get into, or I've already been doing a couple, because I did a lot more when I was working for a big accounting firm. We were doing fair value, which I feel like is very similar, like a fair value calculation or adjustment for, goodwill impairment and things like that, is very similar analyses, but completely different, like theoretically some of the same projections based on, the person, the IP, the technology, the this, the that. What would you say to be mindful of and to really focus on if you're going to do this type of work? What areas do you have to make sure that you really understand it to be able to do this type of work?
I think you really truly have to understand the underlying business aspect of it, probably much more so than any other business valuation process. Whether it's from a technical perspective or have experience in the medical device community and the medical device companies. Being able to say, I walked on that side of the fence before and I understand where you're coming from, and adds a lot of credibility, and the true numbers. Not only the true numbers, but the market, what has to go through, the difference between when you get to FDA and how to roll it out and deal. These are all challenges that most startups drastically underestimate.
Mm-hmm.
They could have the best mousetrap in the world, Melissa, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be able to market it, let alone try to market it on a global environment, going through the FDA and all the other hurdles that medical devices have to go through, and justifiably so in many cases.
Yeah. And we have a company that we know that is a medical apparatus. And now, as they go and get funding, because they're in that FDA process, and they're kind of at the final stages, they have to do one more final test and everything's good. What sort of impact on valuation does being in the middle of the FDA process really lend to when you have such an unknown? I mean, obviously, the closer you are to getting it, the risk goes down, but there's still a lot of risk in there. Like, how can somebody quantitate that and quantify it and support it? Or are these just a lot of the areas that you have to have a basis and understanding of?
Going in the United States, going through the FDA process has a lot of characteristics of going to a casino in Las Vegas. It gets very expensive, and you don't know what you're going to walk out with. I'll give you an example. Is that I know it was a typical situation earlier this decade because of COVID, but you could be, as you alluded to, closing to the end of the process. Well, if something else comes on top of it that they consider much more important and more common that needs to be addressed, guess what? You just went down quite a bit down the stairs. So you're not at the middle or at the tail end anymore. And just because you get the tail end, going through the cleaning up all their comments and everything takes time. I've in the business world that with medical, people drastically underrate the cost it is to go through the FDA process. And people who are thinking about doing it, get a professional firm to walk you through that process. Don't try to do it or yourself, or just have your attorney fill out the forms. No. There are specialty firms that just will walk you through the FDA process. And I really think you need someone to quarterback that. Otherwise, you're spending more and more time. The average device going through the FDA process is about 18 months now, which is getting to be good. It was 2 years ago. It was almost 3 years because of the pandemic and everything stopped. But it's a very, very expensive process. Very expensive.
Well, yeah. And a lot of times they're trying to raise money to get through, a final round or anything, and some additional things at the FDA, because the FDA can be like, oh, go work on this and come back.
Yeah.
And we promise that we'll approve it at that point. And so it's kind of interesting because getting an expert could also maybe allow you to piggyback on some other technology that gets you through the FDA a little bit faster. But what I hear more often is that when they go to get the funding, the private equity or the angel investors are really, really pressing them in their risk. And I think if they had a valuator such as you that was able to quantify and talk about the risk, but actually also be discussing it with investors That's just an additional opportunity they have to present a united front and to support this valuation, because the private equity is always going to say, I don't like your valuation. Like,
Oh,
they just
yeah.
don't want to pay it.
Right. But because of that risk, until you get the official blessing, you're paying dearly for that. So if you need some money during that process, so if you go into the FDA process, make sure you have a lot of dry powder, because if you're going through that process and you need money, that's going to be very dear and extremely expensive money.
Yes, because they have the upper hand.
That's right.
Okay, so a couple of the things that I do want to highlight as we kind of round this out. And again, we're going to have the study available, and you can reach out to Michael. And there's a couple ways to reach out to Michael, either on LinkedIn or through his website. But I want to talk about this a little bit more, because these valuations, like if you're a solo practitioner and you have the bandwidth, that is phenomenal, right? But a lot of times who you're competing against are bigger firms, or, with a little bit more depth in their valuation experience. And I want to talk about the fact that you have a significant number of valuation people working with you and for you, and just talk a little bit about, your firm and what kind of capabilities you have, because again, there could be valuators that are out there that want to get more into the space, and you could also help facilitate that. I think you've helped other valuation people, work through the rankings and even hired them or mentored them, and that's a great resource as well. So tell us more about, like, you actually have a pretty good sized firm in order to do these types of in-depth analyses that you can still do them in 45 days. But for normal of us, this could take months and months and months to do this process.
Yeah, we have a bench, and our team consists of 17 professionals, valuators, obviously of the marketing, accounting, etc. But we have those valuators on a team, and they do a lot of this work. We do, and especially myself, as the chairman for the New York Society of CPAs, I do a lot of speaking and write a lot of papers on this, and I'm always willing to help people out. Be careful when you go through the process, and there's nothing wrong with asking for help. For example, we don't have any cannabis experience and come across a cannabis client. I will call people who I know in this space and say, here, if the client still wants me to be involved, I'll be glad, or I can turn it over to someone who's an expert in this area. You can't be all things to all people. You get in trouble when you think you can, especially if it has some unique challenges like IP, that you don't want to be playing with this, because number one, it's going to get critiqued by many players. And how you write the assumptions, reports are a little bit different, more inclusive. Have someone go through a mentor with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting because, like, I've worked for all the big firms, and the templates and, like, seeing all of the work. I think what you just said is key. And you can be academically capable of doing these valuations. You could have templates that are built by billionaire companies, right? Like, I had the best templates, I had the best everything. But the reality is, if you don't understand the industry and you don't understand the nuances, right, then that's really where the complexity comes. It's like almost like you don't know what you're missing. You don't know what you're getting wrong. And it has been a big reason why I've stayed out of this space. Because I think that you really do have to have a base understanding. So as you see the valuation community, do you think that we're moving towards more specialization? And
no, Melissa, there's a very aggressive approach right now, because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
So there's a very aggressive approach right now, and both in the American Society of Appraisers and in the CPA community, to have a designation just for intellectual property valuators. Just as there is for appraisers of real estate, is not the same thing that we do as valuators. So they are going forward and trying to see the interest of it right now. Obviously, some of these organizations don't want to take that approach, and others say, "Okay, right, it's so specialized now that we need to designate people who have that
Yeah.
experience."
Yeah, and I think like with any valuation topic, are you passionate about it? Do you enjoy it? Is it something that you desire to be advanced in? Because that's really what it takes in some of these. Just like divorce, just like bankruptcy, these are nuanced areas, and we're going to be talking through these various types of issues in case studies. So if people have questions about intellectual property valuations, they can reach out to us. We're more than willing to talk about other types of case studies, and we will continue to talk about them. And we might even have guests. We don't know. It's in its infancy, but we absolutely want some input about what types of valuations people want to know about, and we can present on them. Do you have any parting advice or information to talk about these case
No,
studies or anything
no.
else?
Thank you very much, Melissa. I think looking forward to discussing these case studies. And if people need more information, please don't hesitate to reach out. Always glad to help out fellow professionals.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate your time and your commitment to the valuation industry. And we will be back next time with some more information about another case study. So thank you, Michael.
Have a great day. Thank you.